So I'm actually, I won't go through, this is what I'm going to talk about. I actually have, I included a quick little overview of what I was going to talk about, but the research that I'm doing is actually, this is the research that I've done. So I was actually, sorry, I'll refocus. When I started coming to university, I decided that I was actually going to try and, I was given the opportunity that I was asked by First Nations University if I would work with them. They're actually actively pursuing, trying to find people who would be interested in becoming faculty. And because I graduated with distinction from the business program there, they asked me if I would come and have a discussion with them about doing some work with them. So I was already interested in that type of thing. So I took it upon myself to enter into the master's program, and the thesis that I wrote was on TLE and economic development. And that generated a lot of interest in me and actually how development occurs on First Nations. And and I actually, part of it is I live I was born and raised on a reserve, and I've seen the challenges firsthand that goes with trying to create opportunity on these reserves, and I've seen the challenges that goes on these reserves and governments and the work that they're trying to do, right? So they have such a broad range of work and not a whole lot of capacity to do it. So when I finished the master's program, I spent a couple of years doing nothing, and then I went to a PhD program. When I got to the PhD, I decided to look at entrepreneurship, and I did it in Australia. That school that's on the side there, that's where I did it. So and the work that I do, I've been fortunate enough to be involved in a number of consultancies over the last few years, and all of it is focused on new venture creation, helping First Nations individuals or bands start businesses, right? So I'm actually going to talk about one of the projects in a little bit where we started a number of community businesses, these development corporations, strategic management, economic development projects. And I was born and raised on Fishing Lake. Everywhere I go when I'm doing talks, I use Fishing Lake as an example of what not to do. They've got many challenges on my reserve. So the research that I'm working on right now, this is the SHIRT grant. We got $300,000 awarded last year from SHIRT. This actually is not all from SHIRT. We got $100,000 coming from a community. So this is actually one of the reasons I think why we are given this amount of money. So what are the processes and forms of successful partnerships, joint ventures, and strategic alliances? So we're actually trying to look at how First Nations can create the most advantage for themselves when they're with these partnerships that they're pursuing with corporations, right? There's a lot of them in Saskatchewan, and we're hoping that we can actually inform that process to such that these communities can take that information and help. We can help them, right? We're also talking with corporations. We actually interviewed a Canto representative on Monday of this week, and he had a lot of good things to say. And I think that listening to Lara every time I can hear her speak about these kind of things, there's lots of opportunity, I think, for corporations to you might pique their interest in certain areas, or might direct them to certain to deal with certain issues. So hopefully that's the kind of thing that we're going to be able to do. This is exactly the research objectives that I just mentioned. The last one there is what I was talking about, these tools, models, capacity building programs. We're also going to include, we're going to create some of this as teaching cases. We're actually going to use this material in our classrooms, trying to help it with the curriculum, that type of thing. And the capacity building material, governance models, we're hoping to have discussions with First Nations directly. One of the unique things about this, though, is that we actually it's on the slide here. So we have a survey. We're doing the survey right now. I think we might have one respondent already. Of the 70 bands, 70 or 74, depending on who you're talking to, First Nations in Saskatchewan. 8 case studies. We've already started one. We're working with Muskogee First Nation. We've already started Onion Lake somewhat, but we're doing the formal interviews next Wednesday. So we're already underway with this one. This is another one. Lara knows all about this one, right? So we're actually trying to create this. It's been 4:36 a.m. It's actually listed. It's cataloged, and it's already cataloged here at the U of R, and it's going to be on the dynamic schedule, course schedule starting, I think it's listed. I'm not too sure if you've seen it already, Andrew.
I haven't.
Andrew and I are co-teaching this class, so we're actually making the materials right now. Here's one of the things that we're doing is we're actually going to ask these elders these 3 questions. So we already organized one session, and we had to cancel it simply because we were told by the community that there's an election going on. You might want to hold off on this endeavor until after the election. So the election occurs on April 4th. We're going to be holding this fairly soon after that, and we had these are really, I picked Andrew's brain a lot, and these really came from Andrew's brain. So I told him we need to ask some questions. So I just say things, and he comes up with these things. What teachings do you have that are relevant to natural resources and stewardship of Mother Earth? Of Mother Earth? How can we communicate these teachings in a good way that does not disrespect the original knowledge keepers? And do we engage with the natural resource industry or not? So these ones are, this community that we're talking to, it actually sits on both sides of the coin. There's actually people who are really, really opposing development, and there's people that are for development. There's a caveat that I'll talk about, right? And it's right here. So this research philosophy, this is another kind of thing that I'm hoping that is kind of unique for how we're doing things here. We're trying, right from the beginning of this thing, we had people, I was meeting with community leaders, with 2 of them in particular, 3 of them. We had letters from 3 communities, from a tribal council and 2 First Nations to help us with the SURE grant. And from there, we actually asked them, we started by asking them, we have an idea, is to help us come up with some ideas around how this can benefit you. So that's where some of our objectives come from, and we were actually able to include them in helping us create this. And we actually sent them the research documents, right? To Onion Lake, we sent George, Dylan, and Winston. We didn't get a whole lot of feedback because those things are pretty intense, right? But we gave them the opportunity to have some discussion about, how we do things. And we have an MOU, we have a research agreement with Onion Lake, and that MOU, it actually stipulates that Onion Lake actually has decision-making authority. So we've given them some level of authority. Inclusion of an Indigenous worldview and culturally appropriate research methods. We're actually, we use a semi-structured interview process, and one of the ways that we're gaining access to these communities is we're using a community level consent. So we're getting consent from the community, then we're getting consent from the individual, And I've already done this with Onion Lake, and I've had many discussions with the 2 ones we started. We had that level of consent already way back in the day. These new ones that we're going to get from these surveys are going to help us go through that process. The value of equal exchange and principle of reciprocity. We're actually telling these guys we're telling these communities that we're doing these case studies on, and to use us, right? To use us, right? So if you guys have anything that you need, Onion Lake actually jumped up and started getting all excited, and the guy wants help with the grant application, and I've actually sent him an email to follow up with that, but we want to actually give them something back, right? Some of our brain, some of our time back, right? So that's so just so that we don't go in there. The other thing about that is that we want to see the output, we want them to see the output of the research very fast. So we have an agreement with Eagle Feather News. Eagle Feather News is giving us a discounted 1 full page in whichever edition we want. So we're actually going to be writing stories about Muskogum First Nation in the mining edition in May, right? Danielle's my research assistant. I think it's in May, right? So there's 2 stories that I want to talk about, and because there's every time I've had some discussions with people who are telling me that what's First Nations University being involved? Why is First Nations University being involved in this kind of thing? Like, well, why are we trying to advocate? That's an assumption that's made because of our participation in natural resource sector, curriculum development and research. Where there's a perception that we're advocating development, right? So and for me, it's about trying to provide opportunity for people who are going to pursue to be more, to maybe not, maybe not better, but to give them information, give access to information. And there's a Muskogee, when I first started having discussions with the chief, the way that he's done his work, the way that he's done this thing, he spoke to elders quite often. So at one of the discussions that he had with an elder, they've had elders forums when they first did those and they did some drilling on the reserve. They did ceremony at those sites where they're actually going to drill for the potash that they're trying to access. They did ceremony there, and some of those drills actually had tobacco on them, right? So and one of the elders that was sought for advice actually had a dream, and he came and he told this to the community and to the chief at a session that he had very early on in the process of getting community consent to do this work. He actually said that in his dream that night he dreamt about these kids. These kids were coming out of the ground and they were reaching to him, right? And the way he interpreted that dream is that Muskogee is they're a very strong Cree culture. They're very there's a lot of traditional people back in that community, and they have a really strong sense of these values that were given to them. One of them is sharing. Right, so he actually said that we have this resource that's meant to help people make food, and I think we need to share it, right? So that was so that's an interesting take on how we can actually access these resources and try to gain community support. And Mr. Andrew Miller over there, a story that he told me, and I'm going to use his story. I didn't ask permission, but that's fine. There's nothing. There's a community in Manitoba that actually has been using Pipestone for many years. They've been using Pipestone for as far back as they can remember. They have a legend or some stories from the community that describe how this Pipestone came to be. And it actually, the story goes that their ancestors way back, like generations ago, actually there was a natural disaster that killed a lot of people from that area, a lot of their ancestors, and throughout. So what they believe is that Pipestone was created from the remains of their ancestors, the bodies of their ancestors. So that really indicates a different relationship to that resource than an economic market-based relationship. And that one is it's an area that I'd like to explore a lot in this research I would do. We want to be able to have a discussion and see if we can build some more information on that issue itself. Here's now I'm going to use Danielle. So I was talking to Danielle, and her and I were having a discussion about what I can't remember how I started this discussion, but she's been with me for the last while. We've been doing some interviews with community members and doing a lot of reading and that. So here's the reality of Canadian First Nations society, the perception. First Nations dependency is a burden to the entire Canadian economic system. The reality is the culture of dependency is legislatively reinforced, right? So when you actually delve deeper into what's going on with these developments, you find out that there's a lot of rules out there that actually don't contribute to really good, strong development. So and I want to talk about some of those challenges that are created by the reality, created by the legislation. First Nations were kept outside the market through legislation. So this is a quote from the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board, and it just talks about, if you go back when they created when the Indian Act was first legislated, treaties were signed around the same time. One of the challenges that occurred after the signing of the treaties was there was no treaty implementation. Not many people can actually argue definitively what it means in a treaty, what it means today when they say in the treaty a little schoolhouse, right? There's a diversity of arguments in that issue. The other one is in regards to medicine chest. in regards to what, we're going to be given, there's tools and implements to support development, to support livelihood that were given, that were offered in these treaties. Well, what does that translate to today? There was no treaty implementation process that actually said, here's how we define all these things. It's still more than 100 years later, we still don't have that. The Indian Act actually was created as a means of trying to manage people, not really creating the opportunity for development. So these economies weren't given an opportunity to develop. So here's some of the issues that we're dealing with on reserve. Outdated and non-existent economic development tools. These reserves were never designed to be economic enclaves. When you talk about, when you look at the Saskatchewan mining potash map right now, if you look at Saskatchewan's the potash map, you see that it's all pink, and all the pink is where the potash is and where all the leases are. And throughout that, from the west to the east, there's little white squares, right? Those little white squares are not leased. And those are reserves, right? Those are the reserves. Part of the challenge is because there's no rules to define how you actually access that potash, that mineral that you have on the reserve. So there is Indian mining regulations, right? There's gas, there's IOGC, Indian Oil and Gas, but there's many challenges with both of those. Some legislation creates barriers to business development and investment. So land tenure is another one. Uncertainty is not an option within the limits, definition, scope of the Indian Act. If I'm going to actually go and try and put I'll give you an example. There's a community that's out by North Battleford. The guy was making $40,000 a month net profits in his gas station from the tobacco, from the fuel. And chief and council got a little bit perturbed about the competition, so they actually went and said that they rescinded his permit for that land and said you've got to shut your store down. So all of a sudden they were getting $40,000 a month net, right? And the problem is that the system that's actually created by the Indian Act for land tenure is not a very, very well defined, well legislated, well set out system, right? So there's many, many challenges with that. And there's a quote that I'm going to use that actually argues, that points out that how that impacts development on reserves. So bureaucracy. There's the bureaucracy is involved in many stages throughout the course of development on reserve, right? So they're involved in a range of processes regarding, for instance, access to capital, their capital account. If First Nations are involved with natural resource development or any kind of economic opportunities on reserve land, they have the money that if they don't have a self-government agreement, if they don't have a First Nations Land Management Act, they don't have FNOGMA, they don't have these various legislation implemented, they have to fall within the guidelines of the Indian monies, managing Indian monies. It's actually a policy that INAC has. And what it stipulates is that if you have non-renewable resource money, the money goes into a capital account in Ottawa. In order for you to access it, you have to go through band referenda. You actually have to go and ask your community, can you spend money on this? If it's for land leases and that type of thing, it goes to a revenue account. The release of that is triggered by a BCR. So it takes a lot of time. Bureaucracy involved in these types of things take a lot of time, right? So if you're actually there's an opportunity that an area First Nation was trying to pursue here with the silica sand venture. This company was making a lot of money. They had an agreement with this First Nations to try and purchase that property. They actually didn't. The company couldn't wait for them. The money was in Ottawa to pay for that business, but the company couldn't wait for it to be released. So they actually ended up selling it to somebody else. Risk aversion, right? Bureaucracy is risk averse. They have a fiduciary responsibility. They have this trust relationship, and it's actually created many challenges. The best example that I could find was Samson Cree First Nation. Samson Cree First Nation took the government to court and said, "You guys are not investing our money in an appropriate manner, right? So we want our money back." And they went right to the Supreme Court and lost the second piece of this, because they said that the Samson Cree, along with the Ermineskin First Nation, the Samson Cree argued that almost $1 billion worth of lost interest, lost revenues was created from 1950s until now, until 2006. If they actually managed the money with getting advice from money markets, getting money from investment managers, they may have got a better return. The Supreme Court said that, okay, you guys have proven that there's some there's some, you've proven that part. So we're going to give you back your 350 million that's in your capital account, right? But we're not going to give you, 2 years later, they argued, the Supreme Court said that we're not going to give you the damages that you're seeking of $1 billion, right? But the first year that they had the money back, they actually, they got a 12.9% return on $350 million, right? That's a lot of money, you know, so that was, and Indian Affairs actually manages this money, right? It's actually, when all this money that comes from potash, from oil and gas, it goes, Onion Lake First Nation, we were actually one of our research partners, made $88 million last year, right, in 2013, $88 million in royalty revenues. All of it went to Ottawa, and the only way that they can release it was through the banned referenda with business plans and that type of thing. So it's their money, but it's managed by Ottawa, right? So that's one of the challenges that's created because of the Indian Act. So here's another one, right? Funding for First Nations governments has been capped at 2% since 1996. So you know, when you go to these First Nations schools, you see that they can't pay educators at the same rate as provincial schools can be paid, right? When you go to many of these communities, the roads get really rough as soon as you get on a reserve because they can't pay for the equipment to keep to maintain their roads. Programs and services are impacted. Housing is impacted, right? So there's been lots of media around housing. Lack of understanding of Indigenous issues breeds little support. This is officers, and this is something that I actually included in this article that I'm writing for the Office of the Treaty Commissioner. There's the Johnson Shoyama did a School of Public Policy did a survey right after the last election, right after the last 2011 provincial election. They did this study and they asked these questions. So they asked, German, Ukrainian, and other immigrants to Saskatchewan overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Aboriginals should do the same without any special favors. 71.9% agree with that, right? So with over 4 in 10 strongly agreeing. Generations of discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for Aboriginals to work their way out of the lower class. 58, almost 60% agree, with almost roughly 4 in 10 strongly agreeing. Questions regarding Aboriginal policy issues. Here's two. One of them was, should we have publicly funded universities? 68.4% disagree. Right. So where does that leave support with First Nations University and SIT? The other one was, should Aboriginal people receive their own separate share of Saskatchewan's natural resource royalties? And 73.1% disagree. This is a key policy issue of the FSIN. The FSIN's been trying to pursue this for a number of years. They have resource revenue sharing in BC. They have resource revenue sharing in Ontario. And Saskatchewan's Brad Wall said that we're never going to get that here. Not while he's the premier, right? And he actually had all kinds of, and that's the challenge with these kinds of things. That's the challenge that's created because of this, right? When you see your Saskatchewan electorates screaming at you that this is what we believe, policy is going to be kind of skewed towards supporting this kind of thing and not supporting Aboriginal issues, right? So that's one of the challenges that opportunities, steps have been taken by key stakeholders. So here, there's a thing that I'm seeing out there that's really interesting. There's First Nations. There's First Nations that are there's things that are being done by both First Nations and by government to actually try and address some of the challenges that we're talking about. Changes in legislation have created opportunities. And First Nations are reorganized internally to create more certainty. So everything that I'm talking about right here is actually is something that is driving these innovations that are occurring within our communities. Here's a very interesting, and I've actually quoted it twice in here. This comes from the TD Economics in 2011. They actually they were trying to estimate the market size of Aboriginal individuals, governments, and business. And they projected in 2006, that was what they were able to calculate. But in 2011, they argued that personal income is around 14 billion in Canada for all Aboriginal people. They argued that the business income is up to more than $22 billion, right? So that's and if it grows to where you're talking about, it's going to be more than 30 billion by 2016, right? And it's that if you don't have too much connection to what's really going on out there in the business world, and it's really pie in the sky, but it's not that pie in the sky. This stuff is actually really, really happening. The economic power of Aboriginal communities, First Nations communities is really, really growing. I'm going to give you guys a couple of examples of that particular. So these innovations that I want to talk about: organizational design, creating certainty and strategic alliances. So there's over 260 Aboriginal development corporations in Canada today, right? And a few years ago, that number was probably in the neighborhood of 50 across the country. These things are growing exponentially every year. Even in Saskatchewan, there's more and more communities recognizing the need to create something to create something at their band office. These guys have band offices that are responsible for housing, for health, for education, for all these varied. And they realize that business is a real unique subset that requires certain expertise that many of them don't have, right? So they're actually creating these development corporations. And they have governance structure is different in many of these, different in some of these. One of the best examples of economic development in Canada is the Soils First Nation. The Soils First Nation in BC, they're always on the news as being, they went from having almost nothing to having more jobs. They're one of they provide more jobs than most anybody in southern BC right now, right? They have more jobs than people, and chief and council are the board of directors of their development corporation, right? So the separation of business and politics isn't always really as stark as everybody wants it to be. But they recognize that when you actually become a board, you're accepting a legal fiduciary responsibility. So they actually can separate that very well. And northern Saskatchewan, Lac La Ronge has a similar structure. So here's some of the strategies that these corporations are actually pursuing. Entrepreneurship of wholly owned enterprises. There's lots of examples of communities that actually have enterprises that they own, and I'm going to give you guys a couple of examples of entrepreneurship with other Indigenous partners, and then entrepreneurship with resource sector within the resource sector. This is where I'm trying to focus my research energy on. Northeastern Alberta Aboriginal Business Association. This started by one of the guys that started it was Dave Tucker. If you guys aren't aware of who he is, he was referred to as the Cree Donald Trump on global TV a few years ago. He actually sold Negon Industries recently for $130 million, one of his companies. He's still helping manage it. He still helps manage it. He's actually been part of he started a company that was owned by 3 bands. These 3 bands hired him to come. He was in the band office, and they hired him to come work at Fort McMurray and manage this company that they were creating. And he came very, very quickly to the understanding that these guys were going to drive that company in the ground. So he offered to buy them out. So he said, "Sell this company to me." And he went to the bank, and the bank agreed, and he brought it, and he's upwards of, he sold that company for over $100 million recently, but he still owns a few others. There's over $3 billion in annual procurement that goes to Aboriginal businesses. And the definition of Aboriginal businesses there is 51% Aboriginal owned. You can see so this is primarily in the oil sands in northern Alberta. Here's another one, Scalding Resources Limited. This is an interesting one. We're finding more and more information about this one right now. They're over the life of that project, they're projected over a 50-year life. They're projected to give $4 million to transfer $4 billion to Muscogee First Nation in royalties. So here's some examples of these development corporations in Saskatchewan. These ones are up north. One of the things that you'll see down south in Saskatchewan is that we had very, very few resource projects. And what we had down here was First Nations that were close to the city can actually gain access to markets that could support business. First Nations that had agriculture were involved in agriculture projects. They weren't involved in the kinds of opportunities that they had up north. Kentucky Management Limited Partnership 30 years ago started creating opportunities in uranium, right? So they actually, they now co-own a golf course, they have catering, hotels, water rights, trucking. They were actually in top, a few years ago, they were in Saskatchewan Business's top 50 companies in terms of revenue generation. So they're a significant economic powerhouse in the north. Meadow Lake Resource Development they've been in business for 25 years. They have Northern lumber mill. They create some lumber products, real estate, hotels, trucking. Peter Valentine Developments Limited Partnership, PA Development Corporation. Both of these guys actually co-own the airline, Westwind Aviation. So when you go on Westwind, you're actually traveling. Here's another one. This is just a little. They break the numbers down a little bit. So there's $13 billion in total business income that they're projecting for 2016, right? That's a significant, it's actually, so when we're talking about Aboriginal businesses, when we're talking about Aboriginal participation economic, in mainstream economic systems, we're actually looking at encouraging that participation and encouraging the growth is actually for the betterment of all of us, of all of Canada, not only Aboriginal communities, because that kind of revenue is certainly going to impact the broader your region and your province. So here's this project. This was we actually I participated in a project a few years ago. It started in 2009. I was actually I started working with the managers of this project, which is Westcap. They're a venture capital firm in Saskatchewan. So they asked me if I would help facilitate some discussions with these communities on how they could create a governance structure that supports business development, how they can create development corporations, creating management and boards. So we actually, and the guy, the lawyer that I introduced to you at that one, Lara, him and I actually helped 4 communities create these development corporations in southern Saskatchewan. So a really good opportunity for First Nations to try and step up their operations so that they can actually pursue development in a different type of organization. So here's I spelled strategic wrong there. George Gordon Developments Limited Partnership. So George Gordon is really pursuing a lot of partnerships right now. They've got a couple contracts with various companies. Red Dog Holdings Limited, the Starblanket First Nations. They actually own 50% of a drilling rig. This little community was part of Bridge, and me and Al helped them create this company. And we had lots of discussion about what kinds of things that they can pursue. They had a chief and council trying to operate businesses. And since then, they now have a development corporation that has a management board that is made up of experts, and they're doing better, right? In terms of how Four Horse Developments Limited is Sackney First Nation, Scotland Resources, White Bear Development Corporation, FHQ Developments has a hotel in Swift Current, and they have 50% of a drilling rig with Ken Elson. This is what's happening up north. This is what happened up north. Up north, these companies, there's a guy by the name of Iron. Can't remember what his first name is. He started working on projects that gained, that he was able to obtain through employment with his First Nation, right? So he actually he's seen opportunities in there, so he went and brought a piece of equipment. He went and brought another piece of equipment. He now owns Snake Construction. Snake Construction has probably $5 million worth of assets and millions of dollars worth of revenue every year, right? Up there, what they did was the First Nations a few years ago started connecting with partnerships to Cameco, to Arriva, to corporations, to resource sector, and they actually created opportunity for learning, right? So people have been involved in business in northern Saskatchewan in those areas already for a few years, and some of them, not all of them, and some of them, right? So it actually created opportunity for people to learn. And what they started off as being strictly resource sector focused is now expanded. So you have Peter Valentine owning a pharmacy, right? You have the hotel, the PADC owns hotels in Prince Albert, in North Battleford, in Meadow Lake, and in Estevan, right? So there's a couple of these development corporations co-own Westland Aviation, right? So there are actually lots of, a lot of building entrepreneurial capital has occurred up north, and that's only just starting in the south, right? So I'm hoping that that kind of learning will start occurring a lot more in the south with the opportunities that First Nations are taking advantage of the resource sector here. Here's the thing that I see though, right? What's happening right now is really, it's still kind of small scale, right? I think in the future when these development corporations start getting the $80 million a year that Muskogee might get if they can build that potash mine, they're $80 million a year. There's Cockatoos First Nation is also in the area. If they can get their development, they're going to be looking at hundreds of millions of dollars also through some of their projects. I think that hopefully in the future these companies are going to start getting together and really pursuing big projects. Buying the BlackBerry and saving it. Buying big corporations. Maybe not BlackBerry is not a good example, but there's opportunities in manufacturing and opportunities in the technology sector that require really large investments. And I think as these First Nations get more sophisticated and develop increased capital, they're going to be pursuing developments like that. So here's another one, the creating certainty. This is actually occurring on a range of these communities. $1 million is very nervous, right? That's Chief Reginald Belrose told us that in an interview, right? It's $1 million is quite nervous, and especially it gets very nervous if you're trying to put it in an investment on a reserve, right? So it's shaking like a leaf. First Nations for years pursued rights-based arguments of political agendas driving the focus. You've seen this a lot, and you still see it today. You still see chiefs arguing primarily only on, you're on our traditional territory, you got to give us some money, right? And they have a political agenda, and that's it, right? There's actually other communities now that are actually also including a business-focused agenda. They're still arguing that this political rights-based argument is still part of it, but they actually also have this economic argument that they're saying. And this economic one is actually actually trying to create businesses, trying to get involved right directly with these, and it's different. That's actually something that's different. So political leaders continue to challenge it, and this is one of the things that I was challenged. So I was saying, what I'm saying is that people are accepting Aboriginal affairs imposition of all these things, but I'm not, right? I'm actually arguing that First Nations that are, for instance, the very first community in Canada signed on to First Nations Oil and Gas Money Management Act, Cockatoos First Nation, on March 20th of this year, the very first one in Canada, right? So he's actually, if you ever go and talk to Darren Tormand, he's never going to tell you that he'll accept anything from Aboriginal affairs without arguing with it. He actually is really a strong advocate of them being a treaty-based argument and strong autonomy, that type of thing. So he's always arguing that First Nations need to be involved in consultations. We need to be involved, but at the same time, there's a business argument to be made here. They have a treaty land entitlement. They don't have the money to buy 90,000 acres that they can still buy. They have no more money to buy this 90,000 acres. That money that they got from the land claim settlement was given to them in a $260 per acre settlement, right? The average per acre today is $750, right? So there's a pretty big chunk of money that they're missing. So he's actually trying to create opportunity for his community, and he's partnered with a company that is going to actually try and access the financing to buy that land. Muskogee, and here's another Muskogee, $3 billion development cost, 50-year lifespan, 2.8 million tons annual production, approximately $80 million a year in royalties to MFN. The creating certainty part is First Nations Commercial and Industrial Development Act. If you were to take the province of Saskatchewan, being this right here, And this is Muscogin, this little U. There is no mining regulations that help them define how they can access that potash. So the environmental, the health, the safety, the occupational, all that stuff is missing. Saskatchewan is one of the leaders in the world on regulating mining, because they're doing it pretty good. They've been doing it for many, many years. Those rules don't apply to reserves. So FNC that provides you the opportunity to have that little section of reserve land, have all the regulations apply to that land. So now we have legislative certainty, we have regulatory certainty on this little section of land, right? So, and when you talk to him, when you talk to the chief, he's a guy who's really strong, treaty-based. He's a guy who's advocating, you know, we are a nation. You're speaking to a government, right? So at the same time, there's opportunity here. This legislation that many people are arguing that was imposed on First Nations without consultation. There's an opportunity that's presented, so they're pursuing it. This is another one. So creating it's the same one. Indian Act, I already told you guys all this. So the other one is First Nations Oil and Gas Money Management Act. Provides opportunity for First Nation. This is actually, First Nation, Finagma is another one that has been around for a few years. Finagma was when communities haven't been able to implement it because of the challenges. It had two pieces. It had a piece where you can actually manage the resources. You needed to create the environmental assessment framework, and then you can actually manage the development yourself. You wouldn't need to go to Indian Oil and Gas, and you would be able to negotiate and develop yourself. And also, it actually provides opportunity for the money not to go to Ottawa, to the capital account, but be managed directly by the band. Right? So Kwakatu's First Nation only signed on to that one piece, the money management side. So Kwakatu's now has the ability to generate revenues from their land that don't, and the money doesn't have to go back to Ottawa. They manage it for themselves. And that's Finagma. Here's another one. Saskatchewan actually has a number of First Nations that are involved in the First Nations Land Management Act. And there's 34 sections of the Indian Act that are regarding land. So these 34 sections are really, many of them create lots of obstacles for development, right? So signing on to FNMLA actually provides opportunity for bands to manage their lands without always having to go to the minister. Because if you were to read the Indian Act, and if you were to read every one of those 34 land-based sections of the Indian Act, it all says you have to go to the Minister of Indian Affairs to get Governor and Council approval, which is the House of Commons, right? So this now takes all that stuff and throws it in the garbage, and you're now under your own legislative regime. The problem with this is in every one of these communities, Finagma, Kwakatu's, Muscogin, all of these communities are having to convince their band members that this is not releasing the government from any obligation, and we're not, and that's part of the challenge that these communities are facing, is that, it looks like we're trying to get out from the Indian Act, and what happens if we get out from the Indian Act? Are we absolving the government from any responsibility for us? The last one I want to talk about is the strategic alliances. These things are being done differently today than they were a few years ago. A few years ago, people who were actually involved in, a good example is Samson Cree First Nation in Alberta. Samson Cree First Nation in Alberta had $350 million in the bank, but they actually should have had several billion at the end of the day. Part of the challenge with these, with some of these developments, especially in the petroleum, because petroleum was actually and natural gas was an area that was it was easier to access on reserves for many, many years, simply because it didn't require the level of regulatory challenges that mining is accessing minerals. But these partnerships, a few years ago, you ask a First Nation what their royalties were 8%, right? They're getting 8%. So after we pay for all the bills that I have to pay for to bring my equipment and drill a hole, get it out of the ground and transport it to a refinery, then we count the money and you get 8% of the profit, right? That was the way that these agreements were created. Many of these communities didn't have access to the kinds of revenues today these communities are getting. You know, a good example of a new form of agreement is First Ventures Potash. This is for Muskogum, their joint venture agreement. The First Ventures Potash is actually going to operate that potash mine, right? They're going to be the operator of that potash mine. They have, Muskogum has 2 seats on that board, and then 3, so you don't see that. You know, that's the first time that I've actually seen something like that. And there might be others in other parts of Canada, but I haven't seen that in a project that size yet. Onion Lake Cree Nation, 34.5% gross overriding royalty, right? So they're not getting 8%, they're getting 35% GOR, right? On 4,000, Black Pearl Resources is actually producing 5,000 barrels per day there. They have a 50-50 split. They're actually getting 50%. They're splitting the profits. It's not a percentage of the they're getting a 50% split on 14,000 barrels per day from Hoga Energy, right? So that's why Onion Lake actually is giving us $100,000 to help us with this research. So that's one of the ways that they're accessing that money. English River First Nation, this was in the news just recently, right? $600 million in economic benefits over 10 years. So $60 million a year for 10 years, that's going to be going to for business contracts, for employment, and that type of thing. Partnership between George Gordon Developments Limited, you know, they have, this one is another one that's actually quite unique, I think, and they have a right of first refusal on all service contracts and jobs. So they're going to be, if you take both of those contracts and put the money value to them, they're going to be the biggest contractor in Saskatchewan, caterer in Saskatchewan, which is quite interesting, because they were awarded the operation of Jansen's BHP 2,500 person camp, as well as the 30-month contract with K+S, and that one has 1,500 people. You know, this is another one I actually went to. I went to the United States recently, and we went to University of North Dakota, and we met with the president of the National Indian Gaming Association, and he was what he wanted to do was he can't. Saskatchewan, in Saskatchewan, you have bands that are almost at the Northwest Territories who are reaping benefits from gaming in Regina and Saskatoon and Swift Current. In the United States, that doesn't happen at all, right? Those tribes, it's not as distributed. If you own a gaming establishment in the United States, you reap its benefits. If you don't, if you're nowhere near them, then you don't get nothing. So they're looking at how they could, is there an opportunity to look at the model that SIGA created and make that argument on there. So Whitecap Dakota First Nation is another community that, and they have a second generation First Nations Land Management Act that provides opportunity for the band to give 99-year leases and 49-year leases. And that's something that this did not happen in the past. Many other strategic alliances in Saskatchewan that are reaping significant benefits to owners. Get on that.